Hello and welcome to the Cameralabs Cafe podcast. I'm Doug Kay. I'm here with Mr. Cameralabs, Gordon Lang, and we're going to take a look today at the status and future of the Micro Four Thirds world. And we're going to start by taking a look at the Olympus OMD EM5 Mark III. Hello, Gordon.
Hello, Doug. How are you?
I'm doing great. Let's dive right into this camera, and then we'll take a look at that whole Micro Four Thirds world, give sort of a big picture. Tell me about this camera a little bit.
Okay, so the Olympus OMD EM5 Mark III is the latest Micro Four Thirds body to be released. And to say it's highly anticipated would be really kind of underestimating what Micro Four Thirds fans, including myself, have been feeling over the past few years. It's been 4.5 years since the Mark II version. And for me, it's always been the sweet spot of the Olympus OMD system. So the OMD bodies are the ones with the viewfinders. The pens are the ones... Actually, that's not correct. Some of the pens do have viewfinders. So the OMDs are more like the kind of DSLR-styled cameras with the viewfinder hump in the middle. But they come in 3 and now 4 versions. There's the EM10 series, which is the entry-level bodies. The EM1 series, which is the kind of high-end enthusiast. And slotting in between is the EM5. There's also the EM1X, which is a new kind of top-end pro body. So the EM5 slotted in between the entry-level and the pro models, but actually with a great deal of the pro features, but kind of like the compact charm of the entry-level body. And for me, it really hit that sweet spot. It was my favorite body in the system. And when the Mark II came out, it was perfect apart from one feature, and that is that it didn't have phase detect autofocus. Then Olympus came out with the EM1 Mark II, which had a new sensor, 20 megapixel sensor with a much improved phase detect autofocus across pretty much the entire frame. And when that camera came out, and that was several years ago, I remember thinking, crumbs, this camera is nice, but how nice would the EM5 be with that sensor in it? That's what I want. No need to change anything else. Just take the EM5 Mark II and put in the EM1 Mark II sensor in it. That's all you need to do. But years passed, it's finally happened. They've swapped that sensor in to give it that better autofocusing capability. But they've also made a few other changes that we're going to have a chat about. But before anything else, Doug, how much are we going to have to pay for an EM5 Mark III?
Well, here in the U.S., you'll spend about $1,200 for the body alone, or for $1,500, you can get it with the kit lens, which is a 14 to 150. So it's a sort of a middle price camera. I'd say, certainly you can spend a lot more and you can spend a lot less.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that between the $1,000 and $2,000 mark, there's an awful lot of choice, and you don't have to spend much more than that to actually get a much bigger sensor. I mean, at the time we recorded this podcast, Sony had just started discounting the A7 Mark III, bringing it down from $2,000 to $1,800, and that is a full-frame camera which does almost everything. And you've got to think, $1,800 for a full-frame camera? The Nikon or Nikon Z6 or C6 is even cheaper than that. So that, I think, has put a lot of people off the EM5 Mark III, and in fact Micro Four Thirds in general, because they think, well, flipping heck, a Micro Four Thirds sensor is roughly 1/4 the size of a full-frame sensor. And for a lot of people, for whom size is everything, and size is important for some things, including sensor, then, why would you buy a sensor that's that small when you could get full frame for only a little bit more? I mean, before I bore you to death about what I think about that, and this leads on to Micro Four Thirds in general. I mean, Doug, do you feel that way? I know that you own some full frame bodies, but I think you've also had quite a lot of experience with Micro Four Thirds. Do you feel when you're shooting Micro Four Thirds that sensor size is limiting you in what you do?
Well, this is sort of our discussion of Micro Four Thirds overall, I would say. The only limitation I feel from Micro Four Thirds, there are only two. One is sensitivity in low light, because you've got 1/4 of the sensor area. You're actually going to capture only 1/4 as much light, all other things being equal. And the other is the challenge of shooting shallow depth of field because of the effect of the crop and the aperture. So, but let me say this. Let me go back to the OMD EM5 Mark III. It's not a camera I've shot with yet. I look forward to it. We did a review of the EM5 Mark II, and I love this camera. This is a great camera. I thought, as you said at the top of the show, that this was sort of the sweet spot. The OMD EM1, that series of cameras was very good, but I love the size. The 5 is marvelously compact, and yet it has like full-size dials. They did a marvelous job of getting large controls into a small body, and it feels remarkably good to shoot with. I was surprised that a camera that's physically that small could feel like a big camera in a good way.
Definitely. And this is, I think, the real major benefit of Olympus's bodies is that they put so much care into the ergonomics, into the controls. And as you said, even though this body is really, really small, you really can get decent controls on it. They're very tactile. They click beautifully. You only have to pick them up to sort of turn those dials and you're like, yeah, that feels really good. It's got great feedback and they fall very naturally under your finger and your thumb. And Olympus has retained that on the EM5 Mark III. It does feel really, really good in your hands. And when you shoot with it, you do think, for as much as I really love Fujifilm's products, I find that their finger and thumb wheels are inexplicably small. They're very, very thin. I know it's their style. There's room for something bigger, but they just choose not to fit it. And that frustrates me because those cameras have got nice controls in every other regard, but their finger and thumb wheels are too small for me personally. And then you've got the Olympus cameras, which are often smaller still, but they managed to equip these much bigger, chunkier dials without spoiling the overall style, because they are good looking cameras. They're cameras that when you see them on your shelf, they cry out to you, take me out, shoot with me, I want to go out and take pictures. Olympus has changed a couple of things physically with this. Now, as I said at the start of this podcast, I would have been happy if they just took the EM5 Mark II and switched the sensor. Honestly, I would be happy even 4.5 years later on. But they made some changes, perhaps understandably. Now, some of them, I fear, are to differentiate it more substantially from the EM1 series. Now, the old EM5 Mark II had a metal body, and it did feel pretty tough and dense in your hands. It felt really, really solid. Now, in order to save weight, Olympus has switched the body material from metal to a polycarbonate, and they've also reduced the size of the image stabilization unit and switched to the battery from the EM10 series. And this has all allowed them to save weight, but we're actually only talking about 50 grams. It's gone from about 460-ish grams to about 410-ish grams. Now, that's still, a sub 500 gram camera is still a light camera. So to save 50 grams by completely changing the body material, I think wasn't so much to save weight. I know they're really selling the mobility message, but I personally think that there is definitely an element that they wanted to differentiate it from the metal body of the EM1 series. I've shot with this camera extensively and it still feels great in your hands. It still feels tough. Olympus are claiming that the degree of weatherproofing is the same as before, but it's not a metal body, and that may or may not bother you. I think it's a little bit frustrating that they switch materials on that, because it's not a massive saving in weight, but it is still a very, very compact and light camera. Now, as before, you can, if you find it too small, you can attach this kind of booster grip to it. It's not as big as an extra battery grip. It just kind of boosts it by a few millimeters at the bottom and then gives you more to hold on to. It positions the shutter release and the front finger dial a little further forward. It does make it really comfortable. Now, on the old EM5 Mark II, this grip also had an additional trick. It housed a headphone jack, which was really useful. If you want to use headphones, attach this grip. If you're not bothered, don't worry about it. So, EM5 Mark III comes out, still has this grip adapter. You naturally assume that it has the headphone jack, but it doesn't. Now, this is another feature that's built into the EM1 Mark II, and I think it's another feature that Olympus has removed to try and differentiate them. Same with the PC sync port. The M5 Mark II had a PC sync port to connect to external lighting. I don't know how many people would actually have used that, but it was there and now it isn't anymore. But yet it is still present on the EM1 Mark II. So you can see that they're kind of, they have got the same sensor now, these cameras, but Olympus is kind of subtly repositioning them. Maybe not so subtly. Doug, do any of these changes raise alarm bells for you? Are you concerned about any of these things?
I guess the lack of the headphone jack is a bit of a concern. If I were shooting video, that would bother me, but not much else. I'm really looking forward to getting my hands on this. I want to see what the phase detect autofocus, how that works compared to previous models. Always curious about the in-body image stabilization, but no, I'm not concerned in a negative way about this camera. I'm pretty optimistic.
Okay, well, let me tell you about those extra features. So, as you said, Olympus is famous for their in-body stabilization. They have improved it on the EM5 Mark III. I mean, amazingly, it was already amazing, and now it's even a bit more amazing. So you get 5.5 stops of compensation with an unstabilized lens. So put any lens on it at all, you get 5.5 stops worth of compensation. Put one of their Sync IS compatible lenses on, of which there are not many. Most probably usefully is the 12 to 100mm Pro zoom, which is a bit big on this body, but I have used that combination, and it is handleable. It's okay. And that raises it to 6.5 stops. And that is pretty ridiculous in terms of stabilization. I mean, you can vlog with this single-handedly after drinking 4 espressos in a row, and the footage is still eerily smooth. Now, the sensor, if you are shaking a lot, is moving around. It's moving around a lot, and this is the benefit of having a smaller sensor, is that they can move it around a lot. But that can affect the image quality towards the corners a bit in video, and you can sometimes see a bit of warping. A lot of people would look at that and mistake it for digital stabilization, that there's some wrangling of the pixels because it's a similar effect. But that it happens with the body-based stabilization as well, because simply if that sensor is rotating and angling towards and away from you in every possible direction as you wobble away, then you are going to get some artifacts because of that. But it is remarkably good, and it does let you do ridiculous things like handhold exposures with, say, a standardish lens or a wideish lens of 1 second, 2 seconds, 4 seconds. I was handholding 24mm equivalent at, say, 4 seconds, which allows you to capture trails of headlights of cars and buses going past without a tripod. And this also adds to the mobility message, because you can set this camera up to take pictures so quickly and easily. At, say, Blue Hour, you're taking pictures without a tripod at nice low ISOs because you're hand holding them without needing to, slow yourself down, get a tripod out, mount the camera, and it just allows you to get so many more shots. The biggest transformation with this camera, though, is the new sensor with its embedded phase detect autofocus. I think you get 121 embedded phase detect points. Olympus, uniquely in the market, actually describes them as cross-type sensors, whereas nobody else with embedded phase detect actually says what kind of sensors they are, which makes me think they're only sensitive to probably in the vertical axis. So this one would probably be more sensitive to different kind of patterns. So there's lots of different ways you can measure it. The bottom line is that you now have very confident continuous autofocus, whether you're shooting bursts of photos at 6 frames per second with the mechanical, 10 frames per second with the electronic shutter. It can keep that action crisp, sharp on every frame, whether you're shooting wildlife, sports, or action. And it also means that you get confident refocusing in video, which is really important if you're using it for vlogging or you're shooting, say, product demonstrations or tours around various subjects. So it's just become just that presence of phase detect autofocus has made this camera so much more practical than before. And yeah, a little bit. I don't know. I don't use a headphone jack that much. I know it bothers a lot of people. It doesn't bother me personally. The switch from metal to polycarbonate, I think it's more about branding and positioning rather than saving weight. It doesn't actually bother you as much as you think when you get the camera in your hands. When you read about it, you think, oh, that's a disappointment. It's not going to be as tough. But in your hands, it actually still feels pretty solid. For me, actually, the biggest limitation on this camera is that it doesn't have auto ISO when shooting movies in the manual mode. And even though I'm a very fond automatic photographer, when I shoot movies or video, I generally shoot in manual because you generally have to fix your shutter speed to a nice motion friendly shutter speed. You don't want the shutter speed changing while you shoot video. You also don't really want the aperture to change while you're shooting video, so you fix both of those values typically. So if you're vlogging and you're going from light to dark environments and you don't want to have to keep adjusting, say, the aperture as you film, you need to use auto ISO. So you let the camera work out the exposure based on the brightness of the scene, and it adjusts the ISO to compensate. But if you don't have auto ISO in manual, it won't do that. So I actually, for the kind of video that I do, I find that the most limiting factor on it, and it is frustrating. I did complain incessantly about it when I had Olympus's ear a short while ago when I was testing the camera, and they nod, appreciatively, and maybe they will. Maybe that's another feature reserved for higher end products. Again, there's also no log on it. I don't do grading, so that doesn't bother me. But if it does, you're going to need to get the EM1. So you can see them kind of really repositioning those cameras. It is quite an ambitious price point when you first read about it, especially given the sensor size. But it just gives you so much. You get that amazing stabilization, you get fantastic focusing, you get a beautiful body that's small, attractive, and ergonomically very satisfying. You get a fully articulated side hinge screen, microphone input, decent electronic viewfinder, and all of those cool Olympus tricks like live time and live composite and all of those things that make kind of bulb and long exposure photography really, really easy. So overall, if you're at peace with the idea of that smaller sensor, or more importantly, if you can actually see the benefits of having that small sensor, which is what we're now going to talk about, then I can really recommend it. And in fact, the really remarkable thing is that as the years went by, after the EM1 Mark II was released, and I was thinking, come on, please put this sensor in the EM5 body, and various things conspired against Olympus to prevent them from doing that. I thought, is it going to be too late? They're going to do it, but is it going to be too late? And the amazing thing is that over the same period, all of the rival cameras that have come out have been hobbled in some way. There's been something wrong with all of them. That, in fact, the perfect camera for vlogging and for filming and for general travel use hasn't arrived. So Olympus has arrived 4.5 years, after the EM5 Mark II, but with a camera that's still remarkably compelling, considering we've waited so long for it. So I'm excited about it. I really enjoyed shooting with it.
Yeah, I'm looking for a couple of things. It has a nice fast shutter, 8,000th of a second shutter. I'm curious to try out in-camera focus stacking. I think that would be a fascinating thing, not to have to wait to do it in Lightroom or Photoshop or something like that. But yeah, you mentioned that a couple of times that this is 4.5 years in the waiting. The Mark II was that long ago. We got the sense over time that maybe Micro Four Thirds was dying. We weren't sure where this was all going. Do you think this rejuvenates our faith in Micro Four Thirds?
Well, I think you have to, there's a lot of videos on YouTube and podcasts and articles that have suggested that maybe Micro Four Thirds is, in some sort of poor health. But I think it's more clickbait than anything else, because what do you need to be a healthy system? You need a constant stream of body upgrades and lenses to be available. And for the system still to be supported, you need the company not to go bust, so that if something goes wrong, it can be fixed. And you need a community of photographers using it, so you can talk to them and meet up with them and borrow gear from them and swap them and rent them and do all those things. And all of those things are still absolutely alive and well and present in the Micro Four Thirds system. I think it perhaps became slightly less fashionable because of the drive for full frame. There's so many full frame bodies now available, and of course Panasonic, which was one of the Micro Four Thirds partners with Olympus, they now have their own full frame format with Lumix S, which is also really nice, I should say, but much bigger and heavier. And that's the thing I really like about Micro Four Thirds. A lot of people get hung up on the sensor size being smaller, and yes, it inevitably has worse high ISO performance. For me, generally, the difference only really kicks in above about 1600 ISO, so it depends how often you're going to be shooting above that sensitivity. For me, because I shoot mostly static subjects, or actually don't mind a bit of motion blur, then I'm shooting at much lower ISOs, handheld, thanks to the amazing stabilization, and that's the benefit of having a small sensor, is that it's very easy to do fantastic stabilization. So it really depends what kind of photography you do. Now, Doug, I know you do a lot of street photography and also dance photography, where the light levels are often low and you do need high ISOs to maintain those nice fast shutter speeds. Now, you were shooting with the G9 for street photography recently. How did you find that body? Because it's actually one of my favorites.
Well, I just did an experiment. I wanted to try this shooting 6K video for stills, 4K or 6K. But I think the G9, they had 6K, didn't they? In that one?
It did, yeah.
And it was really pretty good. I mean, you're getting, I can't remember, it was 20 frames a second or something. It's quite a high rate. And it worked, but I realized that I don't normally shoot in a burst mode anyway on street. So for me in particular, it's not something I would use, but I really wanted to give it a try, and it was successful. I was able to set a decent shutter speed and a good frame rate, and I could get some nice fast bursts. It worked quite well for that.
So for street, Doug, am I sort of right in thinking that one technique for street photography is to kind of camp out at a spot where you see some interesting patterns, maybe some interesting light hitting the street, and then you just wait for someone interesting to walk into that beam of light and be illuminated next to the sign that says something like "shop here"? in which case shooting video, and it will shoot, I think, at like 30 frames per second, because it's effectively video that it uses, would allow you to pick out that decisive moment later, because you could, pick out, the footsteps so that it shows. Whenever I try and capture the decisive moment in the street, the person always looks really uncomfortable when they're walking past. It doesn't, do you know what I mean? I haven't quite got the arms and legs in the right position, and I assume that comes with, after time, with great skill, which you have and I don't in that regard. So did you enjoy being able to extract the perfect moment, or did you feel it took away the joy of capturing the decisive moment with just one finger press?
Well, the frustration was that in order to extract the still image, I had to do it in camera. I'm used to coming home and putting everything, into Lightroom and working there. But in this case, you actually have to use the camera to extract the image. That was frustrating. I wish I could have done it otherwise. And again, like I say, for my style, if I'm waiting for that perfect moment with the person walking with the right angle on their legs and they're in the right position relative to the background, to me, that's usually just a single shot. When I shoot burst at 20 frames a second, that means that there's going to be the perfect shot in between two of those frames, even at 20 per second. So it was a good experiment. I'm glad I did it. It's not a technique I would use purposely, but there are many situations, perhaps sports photography, where that might be ideal. Bird photography. We talk about Micro Four Thirds and what the health of it is. So many people that I know who are bird photographers love Micro Four Thirds because of that 300 millimeter lens. That one lens, I think, has made a huge difference in the world of Micro Four Thirds.
Also for birders, the Leica 100 to 400, the Panasonic Leica model. That's another really popular one. And you're right. Yeah, neither of us are going to try and sell you on the idea that suddenly you are getting a 600mm f4 that is, half the weight of a full frame 600 f4, because it's not a 600 f4, it's a 300 f4, which in terms of depth of field on full frame equivalents becomes 600mm f8. It's not the same thing. But what is different is that you can get this reach, you can get a nice blurry background still, maybe not quite as blurry, but you can go off hiking into the field much more easily. And I have gone hiking for wildlife photography with that lens and a body, and I tell you, it's a hell of a lot nicer than doing it with a full frame system. Ultimately, if you can lug that full frame system, you're going to get the potential for a shallower depth of field and cleaner images at high ISO. But I did not enjoy looking around a big full frame with, say, 600 f4, even though I know the benefits are going to be amazing.
I talk to a lot of people about their cameras and what cameras should they buy. It's a very common subject around here. But I think the people who are working in the Micro Four Thirds world are very comfortable with that. If you look at people, for example, in the Sony world, they go back and forth. Should I get APS-C? Should I get full frame? Same with Canon, same with Nikon. But for some reason, people who are working in the Micro Four Thirds world are very comfortable there. They're not thinking, should I upgrade to an APS-C camera? Should I upgrade to a full frame? That doesn't happen very often. It seems to be a much more unique, comfortable world.
Yeah, and obviously you could play devil's advocate here and say, well, that's because there is no upgrade option for them in terms of sensor size. But the counter argument to that is that there doesn't need to be. They're already happy with what they've got because they've bought into the idea of the benefits, not the disadvantages of the smaller sensor and how it can work for them and their style of photography. We've talked about how it allows you to get long reach without having to crop your image massively and reduce the number of megapixels you have at the end of it. Because of course you could buy a Canon 300mm f4 and crop it down to the Micro Four Thirds size and end up with a 600mm reach and the same depth of field as the Olympus one, but you'd also lose a lot of pixels, whereas the Olympus and Panasonic sensors have got 20 megapixels in that sensor size. So that is the kind of benefit in terms of shooting long and light. For me, one of the biggest benefits of the system is that it was the first native mirrorless system available. It's more than 10 years old. And it's interesting how, I keep seeing on social media some, famous photographers or famous YouTubers going, I'm thinking of making the switch to mirrorless, like it's this, revolutionary thing that they're going to do. And it's like, mate, some of us did this quite a long time ago and have been really enjoying the benefits for a long time. And this has allowed a system that's more than 10 years old is a system that is extremely established in terms of lenses and availability, and also a second-hand market. I mean, I always say that this is a benefit of the Canon EF and the Nikon F system, is that you can buy those lenses second-hand, nice and cheaply. They'll rent them. There is availability. And it's the same in Micro Four Thirds, not to the same degree, of course, but there are so many different options available. Now, I've been shooting a lot with the Lumix G9 recently. This is one of my favorite bodies, and it's amazing how, even though it's actually, a couple of years old now, it still punches above its weight. Doug, how much is a G9 body these days?
G9 is $1,200 here in the US. That's just for the body, or about $1,900 with a 12 to 60 kit lens.
Yeah, and that's the better of the two kit lenses. That's the Leica one, not the Lumix one. There is a cheaper one if you prefer. Now, this body has amazing stabilization. It has a really good quality video that's not cropped. It'll do 4K at 50 or 60p. Now, even today, there's hardly any cameras that will do 4K at 50 or 60p. At the time we filmed this video, Sony still wasn't offering it on any of the A7 or A9 bodies. Canon only offers it on the on the 1DX series, and in fact, it's only Panasonic is really the only competition for itself with the full frame S series. Just about the only bodies that are reasonably affordable with 4K at 50 or 60p. So, I mean, it's already still ahead of the game. The only thing this camera doesn't have, it has a fully articulated side hinge touchscreen. It has a giant viewfinder that's nice and detailed. 20 megapixel resolution. If that's not enough for you, it does the composite mode where it shifts the sensor and generates this high-res picture. No good if your subject's moving, but if you're doing archive or product photography, it's absolutely great. Doesn't have phase detect autofocus. Could be a problem for you. For me, when I'm shooting action or wildlife with it, it's actually not a problem because the DFD operates so fast on this, that's Panasonic's autofocus system, that it does actually keep subjects approaching or receding nice and sharp. It does look a little bit odd through the viewfinder while it's doing it because it kind of bounces back and forth. For me, the only real downside is when you're shooting video, because there is sometimes a little bit of hunting. But I'm just going to show you a clip here while we chat. If you're watching the video version of this, you'll see that I'm pulling focus between a beer can in the foreground and the background of the shop. This is Bison Beer in Brighton. If you're ever interested in a fantastic beer selection, it's the place to go. And this was shot with the Panasonic G9, and this was with the Leica 12mm f1.4, which is the lens that I have mounted on it here. And it looks pretty good, I'd say. It's not wobbling much at either end. I've seen some supposedly more confident cameras provide a less confident result. So don't discount this camera or this system. It's a lot better than you may expect. And moving on to the lens, I mean, as I said earlier, the benefit of Micro Four Thirds is this vast array of lenses available. I've been having fun with two lenses recently. There's this one which I have mounted here, which is the Leica Lumix 12mm f1.4, so that becomes 24mm equivalent. Nice, slightly wide prime lens with a bright f1.4 focal ratio. Brilliant for vlogging as well. I'll show you a clip here as well if you're watching the video version. This is me vlogging with the G9 and this lens in London's Borough Market, and it just, you get a really nice subject separation. The stabilization on the camera is doing a fantastic job. It just looks really, really nice. Another one of my favorite lenses, which is pretty unique in the Micro Four Thirds system, is this one. This is the Olympus 8mm f1.8. This is the world's brightest fisheye lens. And it's a full frame fisheye, so it will fill the image with it. It's not a circular fisheye, but it's so wide. I mean, first of all, if you have stabilization in the fisheye lens, job done already. But the fact that this has also got an f1.8 focal ratio means it's really, really bright. So you're going to be shooting ridiculous scenes with this in the middle of the night, still at nice low ISOs. And I do a lot of night photography with this lens, especially when people are doing kind of artistic light displays. I'm lucky enough to live quite near London. Every couple of years there's a Lumiere exhibition. It's like a festival of light in the streets and in various buildings, where it all kind of looks quite abstract anyway. So the fact that you get the distortion from a fisheye is irrelevant. You just get these really nice looking images, and it's just so easy to shoot with this lens. And I've got a collection of about 20 Micro Four Thirds lenses, and some of them are quite unique in this regard. They're either unusually bright or interesting focal lengths or interesting zoom ranges. Panasonic, of course, recently did a 10 to 25mm f1.7 zoom, which is a dream for videographers. So you know, there are still products coming out. There are new lenses, there are new bodies, the EM5 Mark III. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a new EM1 in the next year or so. And of course, Olympus also had the EM1X, so they have proven that they can deliver a professional grade sports and wildlife camera as well. So I think it's not far from dead. It's alive and kicking, thank you very much. And it remains one of my favorite systems. It's compact. It's fast to use, the handling is great, the lens selection is brilliant, and it's so nice to have a system where you have two different camera companies developing quite different bodies for it, but with interchangeable lenses that are compatible with each other.
Micro Four Thirds is very much alive, and I don't think I'd hesitate to recommend a Micro Four Thirds camera to anyone.
Exactly. And as always, we have reviews of all of these cameras and lenses that we've talked about either at cameralabs.com or on YouTube or both. So please do check them out.
And if you're so inclined, we'd love you to buy us a cup of coffee. I especially need it because I'm up early here in California when we record these. Gordon's already probably had his fourth or fifth shot of the day. His hands are shaking like crazy, but I need that coffee. So go to cameralabs.com, buy us a cup of coffee. We'd really appreciate it.
And don't forget the Cameralabs t-shirt that I'm wearing here. If you want to be the most fashionable photographer around, get someone else's t-shirt. But if you want to look like me, get this one. We have links for all of this below the video and, of course, at cameralabs.com.
Thanks very much for being with us for another episode of the Cameralabs Cafe podcast. We'll see you on the next episode. Bye-bye.